Anyone who has ever stood beneath the arches of an old train station has felt that strange, inexplicable feeling. On one hand, there is the majestic architecture, soaring vaults, marble and granite worthy of ancient temples. On the other, a dirty, noisy steam engine spewing clouds of soot. It creates an obvious dissonance, as if a highly sophisticated computer were being used to crack nuts. But what if the official history is wrong? What if these palaces were never intended for trains, and the trains themselves are just a clumsy decoration we placed inside a strange, misunderstood home? The answers are hidden in details that seem insignificant at first, but completely shatter our familiar worldview. And the most obvious of these is their sheer scale. Massive doorways, 5, sometimes even 8 meters high. Giant windows and impossibly high ceilings. Who were these built for? Clearly not for a person of average height, around 170 centimeters. Mainstream science explains this as a pursuit of grandeur, architectural pathos. But in true engineering, where the weight of a structure is measured in thousands of tons of stone and metal, there is no room for empty posturing. Every detail must be functional. If doors 3 stories high exist, it means someone walked through them. If the staircases in the service areas have steps that are awkwardly high for us, it means they were ergonomic for someone else. The mighty Atlantes holding up the porticos of buildings in St. Petersburg no longer seem like mythical figures. They start to look like self-portraits of the builders, leaving us a silent reminder of their true stature. We walk through their homes like mice in an abandoned mansion, not even noticing that the door handles are at our face level. These cyclopean structures we call train stations were designed and built for a completely different kind of user. This isn't just a guess. It's a conclusion drawn from simple engineering analysis. Any structure, from a simple chair to a skyscraper, is created with its user's proportions in mind. And the proportions of these buildings scream that their users were significantly larger than us. Official science dismisses this fact with the convenient explanation of architectural pathos and a striving for greatness. Supposedly, this was how emperors and industrialists demonstrated their power. But this version crumbles when faced with elementary logic and the laws of physics. In engineering, where thousands of tons of stone and metal are at stake, and the slightest miscalculation can lead to disaster, there is no place for meaningless grandeur. Every arch, every column, every opening has a strict functional purpose. Building 8-meter-high doors involves colossal expenses for materials, for creating incredibly strong hinges, and for mechanisms capable of moving such a massive object. No sane architect would undertake such a complication and increase in cost just for beauty, if there were no practical need for it. This need becomes obvious if you go down to the service areas of old train stations or climb their towers, places where the foot of an ordinary passenger has never stepped. There you can find stairs that are extremely awkward for a modern person to use. The steps are either too high, up to 40 to 50 centimeters, turning the climb into a strength exercise, or too narrow, not allowing you to place your foot fully. This is not a designer's mistake. This is ergonomics calculated for a different stride length and a different body geometry. This is ergonomics for beings nearly 3 meters tall. It is then that the statues of Atlantes and caryatids adorning the facades of buildings from that era cease to be just a tribute to ancient fashion. They become a direct indication, a kind of technical passport for the building, vividly demonstrating the appearance of its true builders and masters. They are not mythical heroes, but realistic portraits of those for whom these palaces were a home or a workplace. We, in turn, look out of place and out of scale against their backdrop, like children who have tried on their father's jacket. However, the question of who these builders were pales in comparison to an even more fundamental mystery. Even if we accept this hypothesis for a moment, how could they have erected these masterpieces using the primitive technologies of the 19th century? The official story asks us to believe in a fairy tale of thousands of workers with hammers, chisels, and wheelbarrows who built these complexes in record time. But as soon as we delve a little into the issues of logistics and materials science, this fairy tale crumbles to dust, revealing gaping holes in our understanding of the past. Even if we accept the hypothesis of giant builders, we are faced with a wall of technological and logistical inconsistencies that turn the official version of the 19th century Industrial Revolution into an absurdity. Let's forget about hammers and chisels for a moment, and speak the language of numbers and engineering logic. Any major train station, supposedly built in 2 to 3 years in the mid-19th century, consists of millions, if not tens of millions, of fired bricks. To produce such a volume, gigantic factories operating in a continuous cycle are needed. Huge clay quarries are required to supply these factories with raw materials. The sky over the cities should have been black with the smoke of thousands of firing kilns. However, on old maps and plans, we do not see industrial zones of such a scale near the construction sites. But even if we assume that these ghost factories existed, the next unsolvable problem arises: logistics. The main mode of transport at that time was the horse-drawn cart with extremely limited carrying capacity. The roads, if they existed at all, were muddy tracks. Transporting even 1 million bricks over such terrain becomes a logistical nightmare that could take decades and require an army of carters and horses. Yet we are asked to believe that this was done in a couple of years, in parallel with the delivery of thousands of tons of granite, marble, and metal structures. It is the metal that puts a final, definitive stop to this story. The delicate arched roofs of the platforms covering the railway tracks are made of hundreds of tons of high-quality metal. According to textbooks, metallurgy in the 19th century was just getting started. But we see structures whose quality of execution amazes even modern engineers. Millions of rivets holding these arches together are installed with incredible precision. The riveting technology requires heating the metal to a red-hot state and instantly securing it with hammer or press blows. How could this be done at a height of tens of meters, without modern cranes, lifts, and safety equipment? Chemical analysis of the metal from these old structures often shows a surprising purity of the alloy and the presence of alloying additives that make it almost immune to corrosion. Compare these beams, which have stood for a century and a half in the open air, with a modern metal fence that rust eats away in 10 to 15 years. This is not just good work, it is a lost technology. But even these colossal construction projects pale in comparison to the truly cyclopean project of creating a global railway network. In the United States alone, over 30,000 miles of track were laid by 1860. By whom? By a population barely recovered from wars, using picks, shovels, and wheelbarrows. The volume of earthworks required for this is comparable to the construction of the Great Wall of China. It was necessary to excavate soil, create perfectly level, multi-meter embankments, and cut tunnels through rocks without the use of dynamite. We are talking about billions of cubic meters of moved earth. And here, the most inconvenient question arises. Where did they put all this earth? Giant spoil heaps, mounds comparable to mountains, should have been left around the railways, but they are not there. Moreover, many sections of the tracks are laid in strange, deep cuttings with perfectly straight walls, as if they were not dug by thousands of workers, but cut into the body of the planet by a giant milling machine. The official story asks us to believe in a miracle, in the incredible enthusiasm and labor feat of our ancestors. But there is a much simpler and more frightening explanation that resolves all these contradictions at once. We did not build these stations and roads. We found them. We found them, arriving at the ruins of a more advanced world. And the proof of this is not hidden in secret archives, but is in plain sight, literally under our feet. You only need to walk around the perimeter of any major railway terminal, supposedly built in the 19th century, to see full-size windows that are half or even two-thirds buried in the asphalt. Tour guides and architecture textbooks will call these light wells for basement illumination, but one should consider the absurdity of this explanation. Why would an architect design a giant window, decorate it with intricate masonry and casings, and then deliberately bury it in the ground, leaving only a narrow slit where dirt and water constantly collect? It is engineering madness. No one in their right mind would spend colossal resources on decorating something that will be buried. The truth is much simpler and more logical. These are not basement windows. They are the windows of the first floors. The train station buildings, like most historic structures in our city centers, are covered by several meters of soil. The official version calls this a cultural layer, which supposedly accumulated over centuries because people didn't clean up after themselves. We are asked to believe that in 100 to 200 years, in imperial capitals where cleanliness was strictly enforced, a 2 to 3 meter layer of dirt could accumulate. This is a lie, designed for those who have never thought about the rates of sediment accumulation. The buried first floors are direct and irrefutable proof of a catastrophic event. Torrents of liquid clay and mud covered the cities, and those who came after had to adapt the surviving upper floors, cutting new entrances into them. This explanation is supported by a second type of evidence: old engravings and photographs from the mid-19th century. The vast squares of St. Petersburg, Paris, and Rome appear absolutely empty in them. The majestic buildings stand, but there is no life in them. Only occasionally do lone figures in simple clothes appear in the frame, looking out of place against the backdrop of these cyclopean structures. Historians explain the emptiness by the long exposure times of old cameras, claiming that moving people simply did not register. But why then do the same pictures often show clear silhouettes of horses or trees swaying in the wind? The truth is that these cities were empty. Their builders disappeared as a result of a catastrophe, and the few people we see in the photos are the first settlers, brought in to develop the vacant real estate. It is this theory that allows all the pieces of the puzzle to fit together. We did not build these train stations and railways. We unearthed them. We are a civilization that came to a ready-made world, cleared the ruins of dirt and clay, and adapted them for our own primitive needs. This at once explains the fantastic speed of construction, the absence of giant quarries and factories, and the strange, straight trenches in which many railway lines are laid. The builders of the 19th century simply followed the old routes, dug up the surviving embankments, and laid new rails on a foundation that had been compacted for centuries. We laid our primitive tracks where streams of a completely different kind of energy once flowed. But if the stations are the excavated buildings of a previous civilization, what were they really? Their true purpose was far more grandiose than just waiting for a train. Their true purpose was far more grand and complex than just a waiting room. The similarity in the design of train stations to cathedrals and temples is not a tribute to fashion or an architect's whim. It is a functional necessity, a key to understanding their true role. In physics, a dome is the ideal shape for concentrating wave energy and accumulating static charge. It is not just a beautiful roof, but a technical device, a resonator. If you look at old images of train stations before the so-called reconstructions of the 20th century, you can notice one striking detail. At the top of their spires and domes are not flags or crosses, but complex metal structures, spheres, grids, multi-rayed hedgehogs. These are not decorations. These are receiving antennas. These terminals were designed to collect atmospheric electricity, the very same free energy of the ether that Nikola Tesla spoke of, and which has been meticulously erased from all official physics textbooks. We are not looking at individual buildings, but at the surviving nodes of a gigantic global energy system. Train stations, cathedrals, and town halls linked into a single network worked as power plants and distributors. When old buildings from this era are demolished, hidden metal frameworks are often found inside the walls, which official science dismisses as reinforcement. But these were conductors. The dome antenna collected charge from the ionosphere, the metal framework transmitted it downwards, and the massive granite columns, containing quartz, acted as piezoelectric elements, converting and stabilizing this energy. The entire station is a giant machine. That is why these enormous halls were bright and warm without any visible sources. Recall descriptions of balls and receptions in the 19th century, where the air in the halls glowed on its own. We are told this was gas lighting, but any engineer will tell you that a gas jet cannot produce a bright, even light capable of illuminating a room with a ceiling height of 30 to 40 meters. This was a different technology. Gas pipes and electrical wires were laid much later, barbarically cutting into the magnificent marble finishing and disfiguring the walls, just to somehow light these huge spaces when the free energy of the ancients was switched off. But energy collection was only one of the functions of these complexes. The excessive height and enormous internal volume were not needed to vent the smoke from a steam locomotive. A simple chimney would suffice for that. This volume was necessary for resonance. We now approach another, truly shocking technology of the ancients: acoustic levitation. Sound is a vibration, and a vibration of a specific frequency can change the properties of matter and space. The entire geometry of the train stations, the proportions of the arches, the shape of the vaults, the finishing materials, all of it is perfectly tuned to generate and sustain standing sound waves. Perhaps the transport vehicles of that civilization did not run on rails, shaking the ground. Perhaps they moved through space using acoustic corridors, levitating in a powerful sound field. And the giant arches of the stations were not just entrances, but portals, points of entry and exit from this global transportation network. We, like savages who found a microscope, started using it to hammer nails. We laid primitive iron rails inside these portals and ran our clattering, smoking carts along them. But if this was such an advanced civilization, possessing free energy and perhaps portal technology, what happened to it? And who are we in this world, having inherited only the fragments of its former greatness? The answer to this question lies in the darkest and most diligently suppressed phenomenon of the 19th century. The answer to this question lies in the darkest and most diligently suppressed phenomenon of the 19th century. Historical chronicles record a strange and frightening phenomenon known as the orphan trains. In the United States, Europe, and Russia, hundreds of thousands of orphaned children were loaded onto railway carriages and sent from what we are told were overcrowded cities to settle new territories: the Wild West, Siberia, sparsely populated lands. This raises an uncomfortable but logical question. Where did such a colossal number of orphans suddenly come from? The official story vaguely refers to epidemics and poverty, but these explanations do not stand up to criticism. No epidemic selectively takes the lives of the adult population while leaving children unharmed. Poverty does not lead to hundreds of thousands of children simultaneously losing not only their parents, but all other relatives as well: grandparents, uncles, and aunts. The numbers simply do not add up. Such a demographic explosion of orphanhood is possible in only one single case: if the adult population was eliminated almost instantly as a result of a global event. And here we arrive at a shocking hypothesis that turns our entire conception of ourselves upside down. We are the descendants of these orphans. Our civilization was raised in a kind of incubator on the ruins of the previous one. Our memories, like those of children with a clean slate, were erased, and we were given a new, fabricated history. We were told a fairy tale about our great ancestors who built this world with picks and shovels, so that we would not ask questions about who really built it. We were made to believe in a linear progression from a digging stick to a steam engine, in order to hide the fact of a monstrous regression. In light of this hypothesis, the magnificent train stations acquire a new, sinister function. They were not points of departure for exciting journeys. They were giant distribution centers, sorting points for the surviving biological material, the children who were brought in from all over after the Great Reset. Picture this scene. Trains filled with frightened children arrive at these magnificent stations. The children step out onto the platforms, look up, and see these cyclopean vaults, thinking they were created by the great ancestors from their new textbooks. They do not know that their parents disappeared during the catastrophe that destroyed the previous world. That is why these buildings evoke a subconscious anxiety and emptiness in us. It is not just fatigue from the noise and crowds. It is the cry of our genetic memory, which knows the true purpose of this place. This is not a place for travel, but a place of exodus, a place where the fate of our species was decided. When we are inside, we enter the field of a giant resonator that has long been out of tune. It no longer harmonizes the space, but works as a suppressor of will and consciousness. The authorities intuitively know about this property. It is no coincidence that during any unrest or coup, the first places to be seized are the train stations. Control over a station is control over the vibrational background of an entire city. This reset, which created armies of orphans, was not a random natural disaster. It was the result of a global war, traces of which can still be found on the very walls of these buildings, if you know where to look. And you don't need to search for these traces in secret archives, but on the facades of the train stations themselves and the adjacent old buildings. A careful look will reveal strange damages that cannot be explained by normal erosion or local fires. We are talking about melted bricks, granite with clear flow marks, and stones that, in some places, have turned into a glassy mass. Historians and restorers will attribute this to the effects of fires, but this explanation fails a basic check against the laws of physics. The temperature of burning wood or coal in a typical city fire does not exceed 800 to 900 degrees Celsius. For granite, the hardest natural mineral, to start flowing like wax, a temperature of over 1200 to 1300 degrees is required. Moreover, the impact must be instantaneous and incredibly powerful. These are not traces of an ordinary fire. These are scars left on the body of the planet by the use of high-tech weapons, comparable in their effect to thermonuclear or plasma weapons. Our train stations and the historic centers of our cities are silent witnesses to a global war that instantly destroyed the previous civilization. It is in this context that we should rethink the so-called Great Fires of the 19th century. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871, the Fire of Moscow of 1812, the devastating fires in San Francisco, Seattle, Boston. They all followed the same strange scenario. Cities, built predominantly of stone and brick, burned to the ground, to their very foundations, with not only metal but also stone melting. The official explanations for the causes always sound ridiculously absurd. A cow knocked over a kerosene lamp, and an entire metropolis burned down as a result. Can you believe that a city of stone can be destroyed by a single lamp? This was not an accident. This was a targeted cleanup. Those districts and cities that were too badly damaged in the global catastrophe and could not be restored or excavated were simply razed to the ground. They were wiped off the face of the earth to hide the true scale of the destruction and to build new, primitive boxes for a new, amnesiac population. But the train stations were left. Why? Because they survived. These buildings were originally designed and built as fortified strongholds, as bunkers. Their incredibly thick walls, their foundations buried several stories deep, their lead linings between the blocks, which restorers sometimes mention. All these are elements of protection against a shockwave and penetrating radiation. They were too valuable as nodes of control and communication, as surviving islands of ancient technology. That is why they stood where everything else was turned to ruins. That is why they became the crystallization centers for our new, primitive civilization, which was grown on these ashes. Now, with all the pieces of the puzzle in place, the final, most disturbing picture of our world emerges. We live in a world of decorations, using the remnants of the technology of a great civilization that was systematically destroyed. Our entire official history is a lie, written by the victors of that last war. It is a tale spun by looters who were the first to get their hands on the surviving knowledge and technology, who appropriated these palaces and called themselves kings, presidents, and tycoons. Look how ridiculous and out of place they look against the backdrop of the architecture their ancestors supposedly created. A modern leader giving a speech in front of the giant columns of the Capitol or the Kremlin looks like a man wearing a jacket that is 5 sizes too big for him. This discrepancy permeates our entire culture. We build buildings of glass and concrete that will crumble into dust in 50 years, and we do so next to eternal granite embankments that have stood for centuries. We call the creation of disposable things progress, having forgotten the secrets of everlasting alloys. We are a civilization of degradation, not progress. And the main witness to this is the gaping chasm between our technological level and the level of those who erected these train stations. We have been made to believe that we evolved from a primitive stick to a smartphone in order to kill our very sense of greatness, so that we would never ask the simple question, why can't we, with all our computers and lasers, build the same way? The answer is simple. Because we have lost the technology, the knowledge, and perhaps the very genetic ability to create at the level of gods. We have been turned into consumers, herded into concrete cells and given 8-hour-a-day jobs, so that we have no time to lift our heads and truly look at the vaults of a train station, at these star maps frozen in stone. But the traces are still everywhere. In the giant doors, in the windows that have sunk underground, in the polygonal masonry that is impossible to replicate. It is time to stop believing the textbooks and start looking around. Train stations are not just transport hubs. They are stone witnesses for the prosecution, silent reproaches to our blindness, and the main key to understanding who we really are. Every time you buy a train ticket, you pass through a portal that was not made for you. You are entering the territory of a foreign, departed god, and the system is afraid that one day you will stop in the middle of the main hall, look up at the dome, and understand everything without a word. And perhaps, one day, we will indeed understand how to turn their machines back on.